In this super chill project, I'm going to challenge myself to make an entire interesting fabric from scratch using only one cone of yarn. I got this yarn cone secondhand and it has no information on it whatsoever, so I don't really know anything about it. But it feels like it could be cotton, it's thin but warp strong, and it's in this absolutely gorgeous teal color, so I think it'll make for a fun weaving adventure. So the first step of the weaving process is to wind a warp. I decided to make a warp that's 4 meters long and 275 threads wide, which in all honesty is a totally random width and length that I just came up with on the spot. Because I was only using this teal mystery cone, I had no clue how much yarn I was working with, and I didn't want to wind up a huge warp and run out of the yarn halfway through the weaving, so I opted for a shorter project just to play it safe. This should hopefully make enough fabric to sew something fairly simple. The next step was to put my warp on the loom. My loom is a 2-harness Saori WX60, and I used my usual warping method, which I learned at Saori in Osaka, Japan. Because I'm only using one yarn for this whole project, my warp is really consistent and plain, so I wanted to spice things up a little bit in my threading. So while I was threading the heddles, I would randomly grab more than one yarn at a time whenever I felt like it. So sometimes I'd thread one warp thread through a heddle, sometimes 2, and even sometimes 3 at a time. This added some really subtle interest to my fabric, and it also made the very tedious threading process feel a little bit more creative. The next step was to wind the yarn onto bobbins, and this was yet another opportunity to add some spice to my weaving. I decided to wind some bobbins with only one strand of the teal yarn, some with 2 strands held together, and some with 3 strands held together, which essentially gave me 3 different yarn thicknesses to work with in my weaving. I also decided to make some simple art yarns using my Saori art yarn maker. This little gadget basically turns my bobbin winder into a yarn wrapping tool, and I used it to create some funky, thick and thin yarns that would add some fun texture to my fabric. And now that all of my yarn is prepped, it's finally time to start weaving. For the weaving, I kept things pretty simple for the most part. I played around with switching between my 3 different bobbins to give my fabric some variety, and I also threw in a piece of that wrapped art yarn whenever I felt like it. I also decided to try a traditional weaving technique that's totally new to me, which is called Bouquet. Essentially, you loop your shuttle around your warp threads to tie them together into little groupings, and these groupings create gaps in the fabric that kind of look like lace. The process of tying all these little loops is a little bit finicky, but I actually ended up having a lot of fun doing it and getting lost in the process, and I loved the outcome. Sometimes I created entire rows using this technique, kind of like the video clip that you're watching right now, but it was also fun to just randomly throw in one of these little loops in the middle of the fabric, just like you'll see me do later on in the time lapse. I thought that for sure I'd be bored of this project halfway through it just because the thought of weaving with 2 harnesses and only 1 yarn sounds really repetitive, especially for someone like me who has so much fun experimenting with color. But I actually had a really great time trying to challenge myself to find ways to make this weaving interesting using just the fabric's texture. Overall, this was a really fun challenge because it got me out of my comfort zone and it forced me to think about my weaving process in a new way. Also, if you've seen my weaving videos before, you might notice that this video looks a little bit different than my other videos. I just got a new camera lens and I'm using this video project as an opportunity to test it out and to learn how to use it. So that's why this footage looks all fancy and professional. I don't really talk much about my YouTubing here on my YouTube channel, but creating video content is another super inspiring creative outlet for me. And just like I like pushing myself to explore new things in my weavings, I've also been really enjoying exploring new aspects of filmmaking. And I hope that's been fun to watch. Anyway, back to the weaving. After a few days of weaving, I cut the fabric off the loom, tied the fringes to keep the fabric from unweaving itself, and then wet finished it. And here's how the finished fabric turned out. This fabric was pretty challenging to capture in photos. I found that the best way to experience all of its little quirks and character was to hold it up and let the sun shine through it. This almost makes me want to turn this fabric into curtains, but my current apartment situation doesn't really allow for that, so I have to think of something else. If you have any ideas or suggestions for me, feel free to leave a comment on this video. I hope you enjoyed this little weaving adventure, and if you'd like to see some more of my creative content, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in my next video.